Hi, I'm Ray from the Radio Workshop, where I repair and restore vintage valve radios from the 1940s. My amateur radio call sign is Golf 4 November Sierra Juliet. Welcome to yet another podcast. Cars, girls and radios. How does that fit together? It doesn't, you think. How can it possibly fit together? Radios and cars go together. Amateur radio gear, you can fit in your car, you have an aerial on the top, chat to people. Same with CB, chat to people on your mobile CB radio in the car. Great fun. Girls and cars go together, I suppose. Back in your teens, take girls out, go clubbing with girls and things like that. But how do girls and radios go together? Not many girls, as far as I'm aware, are into radios, especially the technical side of it, putting aerials on the car, installing the gear in the car. So how does this all fit together? When I think back to my first car, or my first few cars, they were so different to the cars these days, so very, very different. Do you know what a parcel shelf is? The older people among you will know a parcel shelf. How about that? You're thinking, what's that? Well, a shelf to put parcels on. Under the dashboard, for the whole width of the car, around the length of the dashboard, was a shelf. It was called a parcel shelf, presumably because once upon a time people put parcels on. I must admit, I never put a parcel on the parcel shelf. There was another parcel shelf, I think it was called the rear parcel shelf, which was behind the back seats in the car and up to the window. So the width of the car again, under the back window, there was a shelf. Now that one was particularly useful, not for parcels, but for making big holes in, say 8 or 10 inch diameter holes, and fitting a couple of big loudspeakers under there. Now the boot of the car, or the trunk if you're in the US, that became the speaker cabinet, so you could get some real bass. So the rear parcel shelf was perfect for that. The parcel shelf under the dashboard was ideal for putting things. For example, amateur radio gear, CB gear, anything, any radio gear if that's what you're into, which I am of course. But also say you borrowed a book or a couple of books from someone. Where do you put them in a modern car? Well, there's the floor, which isn't the best place. There's the passenger seat if it's free, the back seat if it's free, but there's nowhere to put anything, especially radio gear, in modern cars. With the car that I've got now, there's just absolutely nowhere. There's a pocket in each door, each of the front doors, some sort of pocket thing where you can put stuff. That's not very useful. You can't put anything on the dashboard because it slopes and the windscreen is about a metre away from the steering wheel where the windscreen goes down. You can't put anything down there. The design of these modern cars, as far as I can see, is absolutely atrocious. Nowhere to put anything. I've just installed a radio in the car. Well, when I say installed a radio, it's a 2 metre and 70 centimetre amateur radio type radio. Luckily, it's a very small thing, and between the seats there's a kind of box thing where you put things, a very small box, and it just fits in there. Apart from putting it on the floor, that is the only place. There's nowhere else in the car to put the radio, and that is quite an awkward spot actually, especially when you're trying to grab the microphone. A couple of my cars had bench seats, what they call a bench seat in the front, a bit like a sofa. It was just one seat, not two separate seats, one seat, the width of the car, and that was brilliant. You could put stuff next to you. In fact, in those days, just about everyone smoked. So your cigarettes and your lighter, you put next to you on the seat. You could get 3 people in the front, no seat belts in those days. 3 people in the front of the car, no problem. And especially as a couple of the cars I had with bench seats were column change, so the gear stick wasn't on the floor in the way. It was up on the steering column, just on the left-hand side behind the steering wheel. So when you wanted to change gear, it was perfect. And I really like that. I don't think they do that anymore. A lot of automatic cars in those days didn't have that big lever on the floor, that big clonk lever. They just had a little stick, like a stalk thing, a bit like indicators, on the steering column, normally I believe on the left-hand side, for your park, drive, reverse and all that. Just a little bit like an indicator stick on the column, which was again brilliant. What that did with both the column change and the auto stick on the column, it left the floor free. So you not only had the bench seat, but you could just slide across to the passenger side or back again without anything in the way on the floor. These days you've got that huge kind of console thing in the middle. I don't know what all that's for. This sort of big plastic box. It's all grey plastic, isn't it? Just about every car I look at, they've got an injection moulded grey plastic dashboard. So bland, no character, no sort of luxury there at all. Injection moulded grey plastic. I can't think of anything worse. My Farina style MG Magnet, beautiful car, walnut dashboard. How about that? Walnut wood dashboard, leather seats. The gear stick was chromium plated, everything was chromium plated, no plastic anywhere, and the dashboard, the dials and everything lit up green at night. It felt like luxury. It was just brilliant. And of course it had a parcel shelf. It also had a glove box. Now the glove box is a little box, you probably know what that is, in the dashboard, presumably for keeping gloves in at one time, a long time ago. Don't think anyone wears gloves while they drive anymore. That was extremely useful for putting a radio in, CB or amateur radio gear. Open the little door on the glove box, there's your radio. You can take the wires through the back. Perfect. The glove box is now as some sort of vertical thing, like a chute. That looks like a sort of rubbish chute, doesn't it? And of course they do fill up with rubbish. You get all sorts of muck down the bottom. It's a tapered thing, so you can't, I don't know, who designs this stuff? I don't know what's happened to car manufacturers today, the designers of today. I don't know what it's all about. Talking of design, everything these days, your dash cam, your sat nav, phone charger, everything you need to plug into a cigarette lighter. They were originally called cigar lighters, did you know? There we are. But they're cigarette lighters now. The trouble is, you've got one cigarette lighter thing, socket, in a most inconvenient place on the dashboard or between the front seats, as in my car, right under the handbrake, which is completely the wrong place for it. And you've only got one. So what people have to do is buy these extension things, 2, 3 or even 4-way extensions. So you plug that in and then you plug all your other bits into the extension box. But of course there's nowhere to put the extension thing. And you've got wires trailing absolutely everywhere, over the dashboard and all over the place, which is not only dangerous but very unsightly. So again, extremely bad design. Why not put 2 or 3 cigarette lighters somewhere, I don't know, under the dashboard, somewhere out of sight where you can just plug things in, perhaps another one between the seats. I don't know, some cars have them in the back. I think we've got one in the very back of the car. But the design of the whole thing is just, again, atrocious. No cars, early or late models, have anywhere to put a 19 set. It's a huge piece of army surplus gear, a transmitter receiver and a big power supply next to it. The whole thing is about 3 or 4 feet long and it weighs a ton. It's a huge bit of equipment. So the only place I could put that back in the early days was on the back seat. I drilled a hole in the roof of the car, as you do. Electric drill on top of the roof, drill a hole through the roof, mount this huge rubber aerial base on top for a 12-foot tank aerial. You've seen them on the tanks and on Land Rovers, these big aerials. That in the centre of the roof. Bring a wire down to the radio gear on the back of the seat. That's it, you're mobile. I remember one evening I said I'd pick this girl up, take her to the karaoke. She wanted a lift. As I was about to leave, another girl phoned, could you give me a lift? She lived in Littlehampton, that's miles. I said, yes, okay, yeah. I didn't have to give them a lift home. I just became the sort of taxi service to the club, to the karaoke on a Friday night. I don't know why. So I picked the one girl up from Angmering and I went on to Littlehampton to get the other girl. She came out of her house, opened the back door and said, well, where am I supposed to sit? Of course, I got the 19 set on the back seat. I'd forgotten all about that. The whole back seat's full of all this gear. There's wires everywhere. And I said, well, you'll have to sit on the radio. It was in a big steel cabinet. Now, this was used in a tank, so she wasn't going to damage it by sitting on it. So she sat on this 19 set in the back. No seat belts, of course. And off we went to the karaoke club. That was not a car where I had the bench seat in the front. With that type of seat, I could have 3 of us up the front. In fact, once I had 4 of us up the front. There was myself driving, obviously, and 3 girls in the front. Now that was brilliant. And that left the back seat clear, of course. You can't do that these days. It's probably totally illegal, even in an old car with no seat belts these days. It's probably illegal to have 4 people all squashed in the front. But it was fantastic, for teenagers, people in their early 20s, cars like that with bench seats and girls and clubs, and radio gear. It was just all fantastic. I think for lads like me, your car was not just a vehicle to get you from A to B. It was more of an extension of your house or wherever you lived. It was like another room, but a sort of mobile room, really. So if you lived at home with your parents, as most of us did in our teens, you could go out in your car, friends back for a drink in your car up the Downs. We used to do that, take some booze up there, sit in the car, have the radio on, Luxembourg 208, Radio Caroline, Radio London, perhaps the CB radio on if you had that, or amateur radio gear, you'd have that going. A couple of girls in the back seat or the front seat. It was great. It was like a lounge in a way, an extra room. You invite people to your car. Some radio amateurs didn't like CBers. I don't know why. It became a sort of them and us situation. Having said that, a lot of radio amateurs also went on the CB radio. I did. I still do. I've got CB radio and amateur radio gear now. There are 1 or 2 friends I've got on the CB that aren't radio amateurs. They're not licensed. They can't use the other radio. So they're on CB and I chat to them there. I think it was because some radio amateurs were called CBers. Someone would say, we've got an aerial on the car. Are you a CBer? They say, no, I'm not a CBer. I'm a licensed radio amateur, don't you know? And I think they didn't like it. I was called a CBer. I was following a car once and listening to a chap on 2 Meters, the amateur band. And he said, there's a car behind me with a CB aerial on. He said, I can see it's an idiot CBer. So I picked up the microphone and I gave my amateur radio call sign and said, I'm a licensed radio amateur, not an idiot CBer. CBers weren't necessarily idiots anyway. Why should they be idiots? That was totally the wrong attitude to have. In my early 20s, I went to a club called Stearns, which was just outside the town where I live. And I was listening on the CB one Friday evening, just before I was about to go to the club. And this girl called me. And I said, hello, yes, who are you? She said, Jenny. And I said, do I know you? I hadn't heard her before. I don't remember speaking to her before. And she said, I know you go to Stearns every Friday evening because I listen to you on here chatting to people. And I said, yeah, that's right, I do, yes. She said, could you give me a lift? So we arranged to meet outside the local post office. And I picked her up and took her up to Stearns. So CB had many, many uses. I used to chat to her quite regularly on the radio. And being into CB herself, when we were driving along, she'd be chatting on the radio. Because I had the radio just under the dashboard in the car, she'd grab the mic and start chatting on there. It was good. We got up the Downs to Honeysuckle Lane, which is right up the top of Worthing, top of High Salvington. If you look on the map, there's a car park up there. CBers used to gather up there and see what sort of distances they could get on the radio. So we used to go up there some evenings, have a chat on the radio, and perhaps spend a couple of hours up there. It was good. It was a good way of meeting people, making new friends, especially girls. Most girls were fine with the radio gear in my car. Well, if they weren't fine with it, they couldn't come in my car. As simple as that. I wasn't going to give up radio gear. There was one girl, she was strange. I'd known her for a couple of weeks. I picked her up one evening, and her father said, she's just getting ready upstairs. She won't be a minute. And he said, welcome to the family, and poured me a scotch. I don't like whiskey, but I had to drink it. So I said, right, okay, thanks. Not sure what he was talking about. Went off to the karaoke to meet some friends. I went up to the bar to get the drinks, came back to the table, and everyone's saying, congratulations, congratulations. I looked at them, what? Congratulations? Why, what have I done? What's happened? You're engaged. Engaged? Engaged to be married? I knew nothing about this. This girl had told her parents that we were getting married. She told my friends we're engaged to be married. I knew nothing about it. So the last thing I wanted was marriage and being engaged. Good grief. During the drive home that night, I said, what's all this about, all this getting married? And she said, well, we are, aren't we? I said, well, I don't know. We haven't even discussed it. I haven't even heard of it. What's going on? Your father's saying, welcome to the family. My friends are saying, congratulations. She seemed to just ignore that. And she said, Now, we can't have all this radio gear in our car. I looked at her as I'm driving along. All this radio gear in our car? All this radio gear? This was my radio gear in my car. I dropped her off that night and said goodbye, and that was the end of that. I was chatting on my amateur radio gear one night, and I heard this girl pop up on the CB radio. She sounded quite nice, so I finished my contact on the amateur radio gear and grabbed the CB microphone. And we got talking, and she said, "Do you want to come down to the Blue Peter Club?" So I'd heard of it. I'd never been there. I'd heard of the Blue Peter Club down on the beach somewhere. So I said, "Yeah, fine, yeah." And she said, "I'll pick you up," which I thought strange. Okay, yeah, pick me up. She had a nice little car, CB radio in the car, aerial on the top, and I thought, oh, this is good, home from home. And she was a very attractive girl. So she took me to the Blue Peter Club, and we spent the whole evening there. It was pretty good. It was a lovely evening, a lovely club. So I became a member of the club after that, and I went there every Friday night. CB aerial on the car, terrific, chatting to people on the way, and of course the amateur radio gear. So amateur radio and CB, for me at least, did work together, or not together, but side by side. It was a good way of meeting people, making new friends on the CB. Amateur radio was the technical side. I could chat to people about aerials and the technical side of the radios, transmitters, receivers, which was nice. So I had the best of both worlds. Amateur radio, of course, is still going very strong. CB isn't completely dead. There's still one or two people on there, nothing like it used to be, but there are a few diehards who have a chat on there now and again. Well, me, for example. Cars, of course, are still going, dreadful though they are, nowhere to put anything. Well, another thing with cars is, in the old days, you could run a lead from the car through the bulkhead into the engine compartment, so you could get 12 volts for your radio gear that way. You can't do that now. I've tried. Well, I can't. I've tried. Look under the bonnet. There's no way to get any wires through anywhere. And if you do poke a wire through, where does it go? You can't get up behind the dashboard like you used to be able to. I fitted a rotary converter, a rotary transformer under the bonnet of my car, and I had just under the dashboard a shaver socket with a little switch by it, so I could plug in my electric shaver, put the switch down, and I've got mains, 230 volt mains to run the shaver, and I'd sit at the traffic lights having a shave while I'm waiting for the lights to change, and people in other cars they'd turn their head and look at me. How come he's shaving? This was the days before battery razors, of course. So you could do all sorts of things like that to cars, add things. I had under the dashboard this kind of blue light that just illuminated the floor, almost a purpley blue haze under the dashboard on your feet. Looked really nice. You could do all sorts of things like that to cars then. I'd like a Land Rover, one of the old 1970s style Land Rovers, or earlier than that even. You could put wires and aerials and radio gear all over the place on those. But my wife isn't too keen on the idea. So cars are still going, clubs are still going, so's amateur radio and CB. And girls are still going, of course. I don't know how they meet people these days. There are clubs around. But a lot of people are turning to dating sites, which I don't know. I've never tried that. Of course, that wasn't around in my day, but I don't think I'd have liked that. Dating site. There again, I suppose it wasn't really that different from CB. You start chatting to someone on the radio, and you get to know each other that way, and then you meet up. So perhaps CB was, that's a thought. That was the beginning of dating sites. There we are. That certainly is a thought. Just going back to clubs for a minute, in those days, they used to have quite a lot of live bands, and they were very good. The difference is between live bands in pubs these days is, in the early days, the drummer would set up his kit, the bass man would plug his guitar in, he'd have a Marshall amp with a speaker. That was him set up. The singer and lead guitarist, he would have his microphone and guitar plugged into an amplifier with his speaker. He might have a wah-wah pedal and a fuzz box. That was about it. Whereas these days, it takes bands an hour and a half to set up because they've got so many cables and electronic devices, effects boxes and foot switches. There's cables everywhere, all over the place. To be honest, I prefer the sound of the early days when it was just Marshall valve amplifiers, I hasten to add, not transistor, valve Marshall amps, just with the guitars plugged in. None of this other stuff, all this electronics all over the floor. What's it all about? You're probably thinking that I'm old-fashioned, banging on about the good old days, but they were good old days. They were very good days. Funnily enough, all the lads had cars. I don't know what it was, but girls didn't. All the lads had cars. They could drive. They had cars. You'd bump into a girl in a club or wherever, and one of the first things she'd ask is, "What car have you got?" Of course, when I said MG Magnet, the Farina style MG Magnet, which I had, then, right, that's it, you're okay then. Then they took even more interest. Used to call them bird pullers cars. What a dreadful expression, bird pullers. I don't think that would go down too well these days. There were also stickers that you'd have in the back window of your car in those days. All different stickers. I have one on my MG. It said, "Run baby run." I'm not quite sure what that meant. Run rabbit run, yes, but run baby run. So with the sticker, the MG, the Farina style, Connaught green it was, leather seats, all the wood dashboard, aerial on the top of course, got to have the aerial on top of the car. Excellent, that was a bird puller. Another term for a car in those days was passion wagon. Goodness me, a passion wagon, which I suppose they were in some respects. There are a lot of stories I could tell you about that, but I won't, because my podcasts will be banned. But they were happy days, very happy days, with the radio, the clubs and the pubs. There were pubs around. These days there aren't many pubs, are there? Let alone clubs. Most of the pubs have closed down, which is a great shame. Of course, that in those days there was so much to do. There was a pub in Brighton that I'll never forget, called the Bird's Nest. And on every table, you'd sit in this big sort of pub place. There was a dance floor as well, more of a club. On every table was one of these old Bakelite telephones, and hanging over each table was a number. So I might be number 6 at my table and number 7 over there, number 2. You'd look around, and what you could do is you'd look around and you'd see, there's a girl at that table, or a couple of girls at table number 3. So you pick up your phone, dial 3, and they'd answer the phone. Now they didn't know who was speaking to them. They didn't know who it was. So you could start chatting to them, and they're looking around thinking, who's this? Because everyone was on the phone to someone, so you didn't know who it was. Once or twice, my phone would ring, and there's some girl talking to me. And of course, you can say what you like, because they don't know who it is. And some of the things one or two of these girls said were, well, I was shocked. Good grief. But that was a fantastic system. And again, it was technology. I was interested, obviously, in the girls, but I was also interested in the telephone system. Obviously, it was a private thing. It wasn't, GPO or Ofcom or whatever it is, BT. It was a private thing. So they must have had their own little exchange, which would have had uniselectors. Uniselectors from the old exchanges, where they go brr, brr, as they're dialing and selecting the numbers. And I listened out for these. I couldn't hear them. I didn't know where they were, probably in the basement or wherever, out of earshot, so you couldn't hear all the selectors bashing away. But that was great. The Bird's Nest in Brighton. I wonder whether anyone remembers that. I spent many an hour, many an evening, many hours in there chatting on the phone to these different girls. And of course, one or two of them, you'd get chatting and you'd end up at the same table, chatting directly rather than on the phone. And possibly even giving one of them a lift home after the place had closed. So there we are. That's cars, girls, radio. You can kind of mix it all up together, and it does work. Or it did in my case. Just one or two girls that didn't sort of fit in with it all. Going back even earlier, before I could drive, there was a club in Worthing. What was it? The Ocean Club. It became Caroline's Club. Or was it Caroline's and it became the Ocean? That was brilliant. You went down these steps, through this little door and down these steps into this basement place. That was a wonderful club. I loved it there. There were plenty of girls there. There was some good music there, lots of drinking going on. That's another story for another time. Thanks for listening to my podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. Look out for the next one. Bye-bye for now.